Hey y'all, this is Di Banksters for BluefirePoker.com and welcome to my Sit and Go Building Block series. Throughout this series we're going to be exploring the world of 9-man turbos, and in this first episode we're going to look at the basics of sit and goes. First we'll look at what defines a sit and go, and then we'll talk about what makes these games appealing to us as players. Then we'll look at what type of bankroll we need to play these games, the different stages of the game, and how we should adapt our strategy as the game progresses. And then we'll look at some useful software and websites that can further help you in your study. So what exactly is a sit and go? Well, it's a tournament that doesn't have a set start time. The game doesn't start until the required number of players have joined the table. And for a single table sit and goes, they're usually in either a heads up, a 6 max, or a 9 max format, although there are some oddballs on different sites. There are also multi-table sit and goes, such as 18 mans, 27 mans. There's even hyper turbo sit and goes on Pokerstars that take 990 players before they start. So there are a variety of sizes in between as well. At the beginning of a sit and go, as with any tournament, everyone starts with an equal number of chips. The standard is 1,500 chips. And there are actually some sites that offer rebuys in sit and goes, such as on Pokerstars there's a $3.30 rebuy 180-man tournament. And as within all tournaments, the blinds rise at a set pace, and there are different levels, such as a regular speed tournament is usually a 10-minute level like on Pokerstars, or even on Full Tilt it's only at 6 minutes. Then there are turbo speeds, which is 3 minutes on Full Tilt and 5 on Stars. There are also ultra turbo, hyper turbo, and super turbo formats. Some of those actually start with lower chip counts, like the super turbos on Full Tilt start with 300 chips, and they only have a 3-minute blind level. So what makes these games appealing to us as players? Why would we play sit and goes? Well, first and foremost, for players that are brand new to poker, the winning strategy for sit and goes is very easy to learn, but it's actually very difficult to master, so there's a lot of players that get stuck in the low stakes and have trouble moving up. But if you pick the strategy up pretty well, you can move up the ladder pretty quickly. The games can also provide a huge gambling thrill. A lot of people like the thrill of being all in all the time, and that sure happens a lot in sit and goes. And once you're playing at a high skill level, once you're pretty adept at playing the basic strategy, they're easy to play in very high volume. You can multi-table a lot. There are some players that play 50 games at a time, no problem. And since there's no set start time for the games, you can pretty much play whenever you want, which kind of makes it just like a cash game. So it makes it appealing for people that don't want to sit around and wait for a tournament with a set start time. And you know, the big reason why all of us get into this is there's a huge potential for profit, and especially if you're a high volume player, the rake back and bonuses that you can accumulate by playing sit and goes are a huge extra. A lot of players make a big percentage of their profits from the rake back and bonuses, and you can play so many games at a time that you can really rack it up. And a lot of the big name pros out there actually got their start as sit and go grinders. It's a lot of people, once they master the sit and go format, they start branching out into either multi-table tournaments or into cash games, but they always have the sit and go as their backbone to keep them going while they're learning the new format. So what type of bankroll should you have to play these games? Well, there's no simple answer to that question, and there are a couple factors that play into the bankroll that we need for these games. The first one is a term that we've borrowed from Wall Street, and that's return on investment, or ROI. And that's simply your average profit or loss per game divided by whatever the buy-in was for that game, and that's including rake. So if we're playing a $10 sit and go that has $1 rake added on, and we make an average profit of $1.10 per game, that would be a 10% ROI. $1.10 divided by $11 total buy-in. Better competition in the games these days means that there is a lower possible ROI that even the best players are able to attain. At the low stakes, if anyone playing a significant amount of volume is lucky to get 10 to 15% ROI, and at the higher stakes games, even the best players are struggling to get 2 to 4% these days. But because of the fact that we're able to play a lot of volume of these games, we can play a lot at the same time, that can compensate for this low ROI and turn that low ROI into a high hourly rate. Another factor that plays into the bankroll is variance, or the luck factor. And these are the natural ups and downs that occur because of probabilities and winning percentages. Even if we're dealt pocket aces, we're still going to lose 12% of the time. That 12% could come 120 hands in a row. You never know. But you just have to deal with the swings. If you can't handle losing like this, this isn't the game for you. It'll happen a lot. Get used to it. Volume can lessen the effects of variance. The more you play, the faster you can get through these downswings. But it can also magnify the effects of variance if you're also playing poorly or making a lot of mistakes on top of getting unlucky. So because of the high variance in these games, we need a pretty large bankroll to be able to survive it. For new players to these games playing at the low stakes, 100 buy-ins should be okay to start out. So if you're starting out at maybe a $2.25 buy-in game, you should have at least $225 to start. If you're playing higher stakes than that, or super turbos, you should have a lot more, because higher stakes games and super turbos both have a lot more variance built in. Super turbos because of so much of the game being played while you're all in, and the higher stakes games is due to the fact of the increased skill level of the other players. There's much less of a skill edge. And it's not uncommon for even some of the best winning players to see a 200 buy-in downswing at some point in their career. Personally, I've seen them as bad as 85 buy-ins, and a lot of the best players that I play against on a regular basis, after looking at their history, I've seen upwards of 150 up to 200 buy-in downswings, and this is coming from some of the most talented players out there. So this is definitely a reason to have more of a bankroll than you need. It gives you a nice little cushion, so you really don't have to worry about going broke. Now we'll look at the different stages of the game and how we need to adjust our strategy as the game progresses. We'll start out in the early game, move on as the blinds increase up to the blind stealing phase, then what's commonly called the push-fold phase or late game. Then we'll look at the bubble, which in a typical 9-man sit-and-go is at 4-handed play. And we'll look at 3-handed play and heads-up play. So we start out the game fairly deep stacked. On PokerStars, we start with about a 75 blind stack. On Full Tilt, it's a 50 blind stack. And we can play some hands during this phase of the game that we really can't play later when we're shorter stacked, like suited connectors and suited aces and so forth. And those are hands that all depend on implied odds. But we really only have this type of stack for the first 2 or 3 levels. And this phase of the game is over when the average stack at the table drops below about 35 big blinds. During this stage of the game, we're playing basic ABC poker, kind of stay away from the fancy play syndrome. But if you think you have a little bit of room to stack someone, go all for it. We're employing a basic tight aggressive style. Everyone says tight is right at the beginning of a sit and go. Basically, let the rest of the table think you're a nit. That way they'll give your late game aggressive moves a little bit more credit. But the lag style can actually be pretty profitable at the beginning of the game. Just make sure you're confident in your post-flop abilities if you want to play a little bit looser at the beginning of the game, because this is really the only stage where you have any room to do any type of post-flop play. Just make sure you keep it in check, because you really want to conserve your chips for the later game when they're worth a lot more later. Just, don't let any opportunities pass you by, because a big stack early can be worth a lot later. So we're going to employ a basic tight aggressive pre-flop strategy. In unopened pots, we can raise what I call the safe range from pretty much any position, including under the gun, to kind of balance our range out a little bit. That would be pocket nines or better and ace queen or better. From later positions like the hijacker later, cutoff button, so forth, we can raise hands such as pocket sevens or better, suited broadways, king queen, and we can limp all pocket pairs from any position, whether or not anyone's in the pot already, unless we're on a somewhat aggressive table where it's likely that there'll be a raise after us, in which case we can leave off the lower pairs. If there's already a limper in the pot, we can limp behind with suited aces or suited connectors, and we're playing those hands strictly for implied odds to try to hit a monster hand on the flop. And we should generally try to isolate weaker limpers from the later positions, and we can do that with any of our raising hands. Make sure that these are players that are limping a lot and they're likely to fold, but even so we still have position on them, so hopefully we can outplay them post flop. Generally most sit and go players 3-bet pretty tight early on. They tend to cold call a lot more than they would to 3-bet, especially in position, unless it's against a player that we're willing to stack off with, or if we have a hand that we're willing to stack off with. If it's a player that's raising a lot and you're pretty sure he's on a pretty wide range, then go for the 3-bet. But we're trying not to build a big pot without being willing to stack off. Basic idea in post-flop play is to try to take down as many pots as possible with as little resistance as possible. Remember, we're trying to conserve our chips for the later stages of the game, while at the same time making sure we can build our stack. So because of this, if we were the aggressor pre-flop, if we were the one that raised, we should tend to throw out a continuation bet on most flops to try to take down the pot immediately. And we should tend to bet around 2/3 pot. That should be your standard c-bet size. But you can adjust that to the situation. If you feel like you can get more value, definitely bet higher. And we should be aware of our opponent's tendencies. If they're likely to just keep calling our bets, maybe we might want to scale them back a little bit. Or if we do have a piece of the flop, you can scale them up a little bit and try to get some more value. But be very careful when you're in a multi-way pot against more than one opponent. Pots can get really big, and you don't want to end up playing a weak hand in a big pot that just is giving away too much value. If we were the one that called a raise pre-flop, don't be afraid to raise the player who c-bets if we have any piece of the flop. Most likely he is just doing a standard continuation bet bluff, and if you show him any type of resistance, you can take the pot down right away. But if you have a mediocre hand that you're unsure of, you want to definitely keep the pot small and try to see a cheap showdown. Usually with hands like top pair, top kicker, they're usually strong enough to stack off with at the lower stakes. It's definitely dependent on your opponent, but hands that are this strong are usually pretty good by showdown. Beware of your opponents, but try to extract as much value as possible. If it's a really tight player, you might not want to stack off with top pair, top kicker, but against your average opponent it should be good. And make sure to punish any of the villains that might be drawing. If there are a lot of draws on the board, make sure you're betting a little larger to make it incorrect for them to call, and try to get as many chips out of them as you possibly can. Playing draws in a sit and go are definitely not as profitable as in a cash game. The main reasoning behind this is because our chips are going to be worth so much more to us late game than they are right now. So chips that we lose on a missed draw can really affect us a lot more than the chips we would gain from hitting that draw. Because of this, we should tend to give up on our speculative hands if we don't hit them pretty strongly on the flop. And I tend to play a set it or forget it style with small pairs. If I don't make my set on the flop, I'm usually done with the hand. And an exception to that would be if I'm getting much better than average odds. For example, if a player had just min bet or made a really small bet and I'm getting much better odds than I would need, then I would definitely continue on. But make sure that you don't get involved in a big pot with a weak hand. An exception to this could be combo draws, such as middle pair with a flush draw. Hands like that can become very valuable because their strength is rather disguised, and if you do hit your big draw later in the hand, you can usually get a player to stack off with you. So as the blinds continue to rise, and once we get to about the big blind 50 area, we enter the blind stealing and re-stealing phase of the tournament. And this is where the pre-flop pot becomes a much bigger chunk of your stack, and therefore stealing the blinds alone is now worth about a 5% boost to your stack. And also, we don't have the implied odds anymore for your speculative hands, so we really don't play those type of hands anymore when we get into this phase. And limping's not an option usually either because it's risking too big a chunk of your stack. So if we're going to get involved in a hand, it should always be entering with a raise. If we're the first to enter the pot from the late position like cutoff, button, or small blind, we can use almost all of our early game hands to steal. And we should obviously be stealing wider against blinds that are willing to fold a large percentage of the time. There are even some situations where we can steal with almost any two cards against a tight big blind. And if our steal is called, we can c-bet often to take down a pretty sizable pot that should end up adding a decent amount to our stack. We want to make sure we control this pot size a little bit by lowering our pre-flop bet sizing to about 2.5 big blinds, and this will kind of help make sure we don't let the pot get out of control. For instance, when we c-bet and get called, and then we're stuck in a really big pot with a weak hand, which is really something we want to avoid. So if a player is already raised in front of us during this stage of the game, this usually means a pretty big pot. And if this pot is greater than 20% of our stack, we should definitely think about shoving over the top of them rather than just calling their raise. And big pots like these can really add a significant amount of chips to our stack, and they should really be one of the spots where we're picking up the most chips long term. We need to be aware of the original raiser's range of hands and how our hand holds up to that. And if that raiser is tight or if he's in early position, hands like pocket tens, ace queen suited, and ace king are usually strong enough to shove over the top. If the raiser is in middle position, the safe range of pocket nines or ace queen is usually strong enough. If the raise is coming from a player in a later position, then it's now technically we would be re-stealing, and we can usually shove wider over a steal raise than we could against a normal raise because the stealer should be on a much wider range, and the more that villain is stealing, the more we should re-steal. And if in fact this guy will fold very often when you shove over the top of his steal, you can shove no matter how wide his original stealing range was. And you can re-steal on any size pot. It really doesn't need to be that 20% of your stack threshold, but you just got to make sure it's worth the risk. If the guy's going to fold a lot, then by all means take that pot if he's going to give it to you. As the average stack size at the table approaches about 10 to 12 big blinds, we enter the push-fold phase of the game. And this is where open shoving becomes favorable to making a standard raise. This is because if we're going to make our standard raise to 3 big blinds and we had a 10 big blind stack and then someone shoves over the top of us, we'll be getting 2 to 1 on the call for that shove. So why not be the one to shove first, since we'd be pretty much obligated to make that call. There is no magic line at 10 or 12 or 15 big blinds. We can shove stacks as big as we want if you feel it's the best play. And we can also make a standard raise if we want to induce some action, if we're trying to get someone to shove over the top of us with a stronger hand. But don't use this play too often, because some of your smarter villains will pick up on this and will never pay you off. The later our position is, definitely the wider that we can shove. And in fact, there are some situations, if we're in the small blind and if we cover the big blind, we can shove any 2 cards. We should tighten up significantly the earlier our position gets. And we need to be aware how often the rest of the table is calling. And if they're calling a lot, we've got to tighten up our range a lot more. And vice versa, if they're not calling much at all, then we can start shoving even wider. So one of the central ideas of this stage of the game is to never let yourself blind out. That's the cardinal rule of sit and goes. Never let your stack dwindle down to 0 simply because of hitting the blinds. In fact, once our stack drops below 5 big blinds, we get called so often when we shove because our opponents get very attractive pot odds on calling our shove. So because of this, we need to take any action necessary to keep our stack above that 5 blind mark. And in fact, if our stack ever drops below the 2 blind mark, we can call a raise from another player with any hand, just in a desperate attempt to get our stack above that 5 blind mark again. And that's simply because of the pot odds we'll be receiving. The other big idea of this stage of the game is that we are playing for the win. We're not simply trying to survive, we're trying to get first. And that is because 1 first place finish is worth more to us than getting 2 third place finishes. So taking some of these extra risks to build that big stack will always pay off in the end. And part of this idea is the fact that we can shove a lot wider against players that we cover than if those players covered us. And this is because of the fact that even if we lose the hand, we remain to fight another day, but we are always looking to build that big stack. So during the late game, we won't only be open shoving ourselves, but we'll also be looking at situations where we might want to call someone else's shove. And we need to remember David Sklansky's gap concept in this situation. The fact that we need a hand that is much stronger than the shover's range in order for us to call the shove. We can call slightly wider if we cover the villain, but we still need to keep it pretty tight. Usually the safe range is good to call about a 10 blind shove, and that's the pocket 9s are better and the ace queen are better, and we can adjust our range from there. The later the position of the shover, or the smaller their stack is, the wider we can call their shove. And we're getting better than 2 to 1 pot odds. We can call very wide as long as calling the shove doesn't cripple us. There are even plenty of spots where we can call with any 2 cards. And when someone has already shoved and they get a caller, we have to tighten up our range even more, usually as tight as only calling with pocket queens or better. Another big spot where we can pick up a lot of chips is whenever there are limpers in the pot, and even as the blinds are getting high, weaker players can continue to limp, and their extra chips in the pot make a much bigger pot, so we can shove over them for a much bigger reward. And we should tend to do this if they fold a lot or if they have a really wide limping range, so our hand could be pretty strong against their range. But we need to watch out for trappers, because a lot of players kind of exploit this tendency of people to shove over limpers by limping with their strongest hands. So we're going to make sure that if it's a normally aggressive player that's limping, that we kind of tighten up our range a little more when shoving over the top of them. And we also need to be a lot tighter when there are multiple limpers, since the pot will be bigger, and this will give one of the limpers pretty attractive pot odds to call if we do shove. Once the table has gotten down to 4 players, we've reached the bubble. And this is the most critical stage of the sit and go, since if we bust out at this point, we get no money, whereas the other players make the money. We need to adjust our strategy at this point of the game based on our standing amongst the other players. If we are not the chip leader at this point, we need to avoid confrontations with the chip leader at all costs. We need to attack villains that we cover in order to build our stack. They need to be very risk averse against us, as if they lose a hand, they will be gone. We also need to target players that have a stack size similar to ours for the very same reasons. If they lose a hand to us, they will be pretty much crippled and pretty close to out of the game with no money. We need to shove and call much tighter against players that cover us by a significant margin. And this is simply because they can call us a little bit looser, or they can shove a little bit looser against us, since if they lose the hand, they can survive. And we need to be aware of other players that could make mistakes that could benefit or hurt us in the long run. If they are calling really loose and other players are shoving really loose, well then they could wind up busting out long before us, and we could really benefit by just sitting back and letting them bust out. And we need to remember, if we are the ones to make a mistake, or if we let ourselves blind out, everyone at the table benefits but you. We don't want to just simply hand money to everyone else by our own poor judgment. If we are the chip leader, we need to shove very wide, and we are trying to build our stack as much as possible so that when we do make the money, our job becomes even easier to play for the win. The more that we cover the other players, the wider we can shove. And in fact, if we cover everyone by at least 5 big blinds, we can shove more than half of our hands. And this is simply because of the fact if we lose an all-in, we still have a somewhat playable stack left. And if we have more than twice the stack of everyone else, we can pretty much shove any 2 cards. And this is what a lot of players call pwning. It's when we are basically stealing chips off everyone else because they are so risk averse against us, and they will be gone if they call one of our shoves and lose. So they need to be very tight against us. We need to exploit this for everything it's worth and build our stack as big as possible. We need to be aware of loose callers that could make some mistakes so that we can keep our big stack. If we have plenty of loose callers at the table, we should tighten up a little bit, but definitely keep the aggression on. And we're trying to accumulate as many chips as possible at this stage to get that big stack to make sure that we lock in the win. So once the bubble is burst and there are only 3 players remaining, we have made the money. But we need to keep up our aggression at this point, since our object is to maximize our profit. And we need to do this by taking some worthwhile risks. It's very similar to bubble play in that our decisions are heavily influenced on whether or not we are covered by other players that we are shoving into or that we're calling their shoves. We need to apply constant pressure to weaker opponents, and we need to keep in mind that many villains will get a lot looser once they've made the money because they've already profited. So we need to adjust our ranges to reflect the looser competition. We really need to attack these big pots at this point of the game, and when the stacks are deeper than about 15 blinds, we can re-steal very wide, especially if we're covering the villain or if it's a guy that steals a lot and then folds to a raise. These big pots will really help us play for the win. And our range for calling shoves should get quite a bit looser than it would earlier, since most villains will be shoving a lot wider, but don't abuse this fact. Keep it in check, and remember we need to conserve our chips at the same time trying to take some bigger risks. And because our object at this point of the game is to build a dominant stack for when we get into the heads up phase, and that'll make it much simpler. Once we've reached the heads up stage of the game, we're already guaranteed second place and 30% of the prize pool, but our goal is obviously to tack on that extra 20% and go for the win. This stage of the game is usually over in a few hands, especially in turbo games, and there'll be a pretty fast and furious pace to heads up play. Aggression will win a lot of pots at this stage of the game, and your passive play would obviously lose them. When the stacks are deeper than about 20 big blinds, we should be raising every chance we get, regardless of what our cards are, until the villain fights back. If he does fight back, we can tighten up a bit, but keep the aggression on. And if the villain himself is being aggressive and raising a lot, we should tend to 3-bet pretty loose to put him in check. And remember that pot odds will play a dominant role when calling raises or shoves, since our call will close the action and pot odds are exactly as they seem. If we get any piece of a flop, should we see a flop, we need to bet it strongly for value, because we need to remember that post-flop hand strengths do not need to be as strong when we're heads up as they would have been in early game. And in fact, many showdowns are won simply by high card, so don't be afraid to show down king high in a small pot. Both players are usually fairly short stacked, so if we are below that about 20 blind mark, push fold usually becomes the dominant style. We can use what's known as a Nash equilibrium push fold strategy against an unknown player or against a player that we feel might be more skilled. And the Nash equilibrium strategy is a mathematically unexploitable strategy that if we are pushing a certain range of hands for each blind level, then the opponent cannot adjust by calling tighter or looser and have a higher expected value against us long term. We'll look more in depth at the Nash equilibrium on the next slide. So here we are at hold'emresources.net, home of the Nash equilibrium heads up push fold charts. The chart we're looking at right now is if you are in the small blind, which would make you the pusher. And the way we use this chart is we locate our hand on the chart. The suited hands are in the upper right hand corner here, the offsuit hands in the bottom left, and all of our pocket pairs are along the diagonal in the light blue shade. So first we locate our hand. Let's say we're looking at 10-6 offsuit, which would be right here. The number in that cell is how many blinds we can shove with that hand. So we can shove 5.7 blinds with 10-6 offsuit. And this assumes that your opponent is calling perfectly, but if he's calling less than perfectly, he really cannot adjust to profit more against your range of hands. So that makes this an unexploitable strategy, meaning it's pretty much a safe way to play, which is why we say to use it against unknown opponents or against opponents that you feel may be more skilled than you. However, it does not mean it's the most profitable way to play. There are adjustments you can make outside of the Nash equilibrium that could increase your profit long term. But we're just trying to show you a simple way here to get started with your heads up play. So we have the pusher chart here, and down below it has the calling chart. So if you're in the big blind and the small blind had shoved to you, these are the hands that you can call with at that certain level. So we'll look at the 10-6 offsuit again. If someone shoves 4.6 blinds against us and we're holding 10-6 offsuit, then we should theoretically make a call. This website has a lot of great other resources here as well, such as the heads up calculator. And it basically takes the numbers off of the chart and just puts them into an accurate range for each blind level. So we can look at, say, a 10 blind stack and hit the calculate button, and it'll give us our exact ranges that we can either shove from the small blind, which you can see we could shove over 58% of hands here when we have a 10 blind stack, or the hands we can call from the big blind, and that would be over 37% of hands here. This does account for a little bit of what they call mixed strategies. So you see here at the end the 4-3 suited and the 71%. That's saying the way this was calculated was with only shoving 4-3 suited 71% of the time that we were holding it. And same thing with the Queen-6 suited. That would be only calling with Queen-6 suited 39.6% of the time that we hold it, and the other times folding it. In reality, you're not going to be able to, do these mixed strategy percentages exactly, but for most part, most of these hands are either 100% shove or 100% calling. So let's look at a couple other examples here and just see how wide we can be shoving and calling when we're heads up. Check out a 5 blind stack level here, and we're shoving over 70% of our hands here and actually calling with over 62% of our hands. There's not that wide of a gap the lower our stacks go because of the pot odds we'll be receiving on the call for the shove. Another cool thing that this website has is what's called its Nash Equilibrium Calculator, and this goes beyond just the heads up stage and tries to approximate a Nash equilibrium for different amounts of players at the table. So let's just, for example, take a look at a evenly split bubble hand where everyone has even amount of chips at 3,375 chips. And let's say we're at big blind 400, which would make the small blind 200. And I believe the ante is usually 25 at that level. Could be wrong, could be 50. Don't quote me. And once we hit the calculate button, you can see the range of hands that we could shove if we were in the cutoff, which would be almost 34% of hands. In the button, we could shove 44% of hands. And in the small blind, we could shove 100% of hands. Down below, in a more detailed chart form, it shows you exactly what hands you could shove from that position. So the PU column stands for the pushing column. So if you're in the cutoff, you could shove 33.9% of hands. The CA is the calling column. So the way we look at this is to say if the cutoff shoves, the button can call 2.6% of hands. And the OC would be overcalling. So if the cutoff shoves and the button calls, the small blind can only call with pocket aces to be correct under the Nash equilibrium. There are a few other things here in their beta section. How they have a new feature of the Nash calculator, and it's kind of a little buggy at this point in time, but it's worth checking out and checking back from time to time to see how their thread progresses. And it's definitely going to be a useful tool for you in your studies. Another great website that can help you with your sit and go play is sharkscope.com. Sharkscope is an online database of sit and go results, and you are able to look up players and see what their statistics look like, how much profit they've played, how many games they've played, and there's a variety of different statistics that you can check out here. One big caution about Sharkscope is that PokerStars and Full Tilt really frown upon the usage of Sharkscope while you're playing at the tables. So make sure that you never have Sharkscope running while you have the Full Tilt or PokerStars client running at the same time. The Sharkscope is actually listed on both sites' list of prohibited websites and tools. So make sure you use this with caution. I'm of the opinion that Sharkscope is actually good for the games because it allows winning players to avoid each other, and therefore it makes the table easier for beginning players because there will be less winning players at the table. So however you feel about it, just make sure you play it safe while using Sharkscope. One great thing about SharkScope is the leaderboards feature that they have that allows you to track the best players in different categories. We can check out, let's say, the 9-man turbo leaderboard for any stakes, total profit 2010. So these are the players that have made the most money playing 9-man turbo sit and goes so far this year. And you can see we've got some players all the way up to $70,000 profit so far this year. If you click on any player's name, it'll bring up detailed statistics for those players where you can see how many games they've played, the average profit that they make per game, the average buy-in level that they play at, what their average return on investment is, and how much total profit they've made in their career. And we have the ability rating over here, which is a way to distinguish between skill level of players at different buy-in levels. If you see a player that maybe has a 20% ROI but only has an ability rating of, say, 70, it's probably because he's playing very low buy-in games, and therefore he might not be as good as a player that only has a 4% ROI but he's playing at the high stakes like this. And if you click on a player's name, you can bring up further details. You can see graphs of all the games that they've played, along with their ROI against their entry fee. And there's a number of more detailed graphs that you can use by looking under more options. And you can explore around with these when you have some time. SharkScope is a subscription service, but on most sites, a lot of this data is available for free with 5 searches per day. For PokerStars players, you're not able to see their data unless they have opted in. Subscribers, you are able to see all of the data for PokerStars players. And if you are ever getting serious about your sit and go play, I would highly recommend a SharkScope subscription so you can start checking out the players that you are up against on a regular basis. You can also do an advanced search here where you can filter out between the different types of games they've played. So let's say I want to look at only the Turbo 9-mans that this guy's played. And let's say his name is Leo C900 on PokerStars. And we can see he's played about half of his games were at the 9-man turbos. He's got about a 3% average ROI. So it's a pretty decent player, and something you can all aspire to be is to play like Leo C here. Sit and Go Wizard is a great tool that you can use for analyzing your own late game play and to practice different strategies for the entire push-fold stage of the game. There are a couple good features of Sit and Go Wizard that you should really become familiar with very quickly, as it will really help you progress your game to a new level. The first thing we're going to check out is how to manually analyze a situation, and you do that by the Analyze a New Game option. The first thing to do would be to pick a tournament structure. So let's say we want to look at the classic full tilt payout structure for 9-mans. And let's just set up a situation. Let's look at the standard even split stack bubble situation, where each player has 3,375 chips. And let's say we want to look at a situation from the small blind on whether or not we should push or fold. So we'll assign ourselves a card, let's say Jack 4 offsuit, and decide whether or not we want to push or fold. And it's hands like this are going to be entirely dependent on what your opponent's range is. So we can adjust the big blind's range of calling hands for what we think would be logical this player might be calling with. So you can adjust it up or down, and as you adjust it you can see how the range of hands that you would shove will change. And you can see if this player is only calling with 16% of hands, that it recommends that we shove 100% of hands. You can come back in and adjust all of the stack information to see how changes in the stack sizes would affect your decisions. And you can change any different amount of variables. You can say, what if the cutoff player had pushed, and then adjust his range and see how we should adjust ours on top of that. It's really great for exploring around different situations and seeing how small changes at the table really affect the range of hands that we can play. One of the other great features of Sit and Go Wizard is the ability to analyze games you've already played. So you could do this by open a tournament folder option, and you can use the dialog box to select a folder where you have your hand history saved, and it will automatically import these hands and look for any type of errors that it may consider that you have made throughout these games. So you just click on the tournament ID and it will bring up that hand already analyzed for you. No manual input necessary. You should never really rely on the default ranges that are built in here into Sit and Go Wizard, these call ranges here. Although they are fairly accurate under most circumstances, you should really rely on what your reads were for the players in game. And always make sure that these numbers look sensible to you. Another thing that can really help out beginning players is the quiz feature of Sit and Go Wizard. And you can set it up for a variety of different situations. So let's take a look at, got it set up for the PokerStars standard 9-man structure here. And let's say we want to practice our bubble hands. So we can set it up for 4 players, minimum and maximum number of players. Then we can even practice what position we want to go from. We can set it to any, so we can have a random position. And say we only want to practice pushing at this point, so we leave it on push only. And Sit and Go Wizard will generate a bunch of random situations and ask us whether or not we want to push or fold for these situations. And it will come up with the results and let you know whether or not your decision was correct based on the information given to you at the table. Hold'em Manager will quickly become your best friend on your course to becoming a winning Sit and Go player. We're going to go over some of the basic features here just to give you an idea of the usage you can get out of this program. The first thing on the first tab you want to check out is the Import tab, where you can either import specific hand history files, you can import an entire folder of files, or you can set it up to auto import your files while you're playing to keep your heads-up display up to date. Then the most important other tabs for us as Sit and Go players would be number 1 on the Results tab, and this would be where we can see our detailed results for all games that we've played and that have been imported in the Manager database. And you could see detailed finish positions for how you've played. You can filter out different buy-ins of the different types of games you've played or the size based on the number of players. You can even pick different date ranges to filter this down even more. And there are several different tabs over here, such as in the Data View tab, where you can see each individual tournament that you've played, and the hands for that tournament will be listed down below. You can see the Stats tab, where you can run different reports that will break down your results by the buy-in level you've played, by how many tables you're playing at a time, and also give you daily and monthly stats. And you can see your so-called coveted graph. Graphs aren't everything. Everyone likes to see them pretty, and I usually just leave my green line there. We can have a big argument at some point in time about whether or not to leave the red line on. I'm not a huge believer in its accuracy, and I think it can damage your confidence or inflate your confidence, whether or not you're playing above or below your red line. So I tend to leave it off and pay no attention to it. And the trending tab's really not that useful. I don't pay much attention to it, but it can let you know if you've taken a turn for the worse or if you started playing better. On the reports tab is a place where we can do a lot of different analysis of our game. There are a number of different reports built into Hold'em Manager, such as the position report, number of players report, hand groupings, hole cards, that can really help us break down our play into different categories and try to analyze our play in a more effective way. You can set any number of filters through the built-in filter function. You can look at hands, for example, from only the small blind and unopened pots, and here I have it set just for 4 players, so we're looking at very specific situations. And you can see all hands down below that meet the criteria for the report and for the filters that you've set. Recently, Sit and Go Wizard has actually partnered up with Hold'em Manager, so now they are integrated together as one. So you can highlight any of these hands down below, right click on it, and send it to Sit and Go Wizard, and it will actually do the Sit and Go Wizard analysis right within Hold'em Manager, which is a great time saver. Another great feature of Hold'em Manager is the built-in replayer. If you highlight any of your hands and right click, you can bring it up in the replayer by selecting replay selected hands. And the great thing about the replayer is it will bring up your heads up display with it, so you can see any of the stats that you have built up on the players, so you know exactly what you were thinking while you were playing this game, and you have all the exact same information right in front of you. And it's really useful for going back and reviewing your own games and looking for spots that you might have missed, hands that you might have misplayed, and really driving these different situations into your head to really make them more automatic while you're playing. It has a number of different controls to step through the hand piece by piece. You can set it to run automatically by clicking the Go button, and there are different controls to switch back and forth between hands. Well, now that you know a little more about what it takes to beat Sit and Goes, just get out there and play some games. There's no substitute for real game experience. And I'd like to thank you for joining me today. And for BlueFirePoker.com, this has been Die Banksters, and we'll see you all next time.